Good morning. I was thinking a moment ago that this is the first Sunday that Brother Tim Rogers is not with us as we approach God's throne on the Lord's Day. But then I thought that's not really true. It may be the first time that we are doing so without him in our midst, but we're simply going to the place where he's able to be in the presence of the Lord all the time. And we only get to come up here ever so often. But that's true not only with Tim, but with all of God's saints who have gone before us and whose mighty throng and number we one day aspire to join. It's good to see everyone this morning. We do have visitors, as we always do, and we're grateful for your presence. We want to encourage you in every good way that we can, and if there's something that we can do for you while you're among us, please don't hesitate to ask. We are wrapping up this morning a series of lessons, a very short series of lessons that we've titled Finding Your Way. And it's all about trying to determine God's will for your life when the way is unclear. Trying to make decisions that you believe will be consistent with God's will, the path that He has in mind for you to follow, when you really can't see for sure and there's uncertainty about which direction you should go. And that's pretty much all of us all the time, isn't it? Pretty much all of us are facing decisions where we're just not sure what the best option is. What's the right choice? What's the God-honoring decision here? What's the best thing that I could do given the circumstance in which we find ourselves? And we've talked about two things already. First, that if you want to be able to see what God's will for you in the future is, then you need to be living consistently with what God's plan is as revealed to us in Scripture and in obedience to His moral commands that are also revealed to us in Scripture. That unless our lives are plumb and square with God's overarching plan to take everything from what we read in Genesis 1 to Revelation 22, if we have that worldview, that framework in which to understand our situation, it gives us some clarity about how to move forward in this world in a way that's going to be consistent with what God is trying to accomplish and is accomplishing in the world. And then also when we align ourselves with what God has commanded us as regards His moral truths, the way He wants us to treat other people, primarily when we're living consistently with that, then we are best positioned to be able to see our next step forward. If we're out of whack with those things, it's going to be impossible for us to live in God's will moving forward. But then also we've seen that the next thing that you need to do is surround yourself with godly and wise people. The world is full of evil people. The world is full of foolish people. But there are some wise and godly people that you can surround yourself with. And in their company, you are going to have a lot better odds of seeing God's will for you going forward and being directed in the path that you should take, because you'll have their counsel as well as your own, their perspective on your life as well as your own. And we all need that very, very much. And this morning we're going to talk about the third and final principle that can help us discern God's will for our lives when the way is unclear, and that is that you just take the next step, and you do so in faith and confidence that God's got you. Now this lesson only works when the first two lessons are already in place. So I usually don't do this. Usually in an introduction, I'm trying to get some point of contact with every person in the audience, but I'm going to just be honest with you this morning. This lesson isn't for everyone. If you're not trusting in God's plan, if you're not living in obedience to God's commands and you know it, and you're choosing to walk with foolish people or evil people and neglecting the counsel of the wise, then what we're going to talk about this morning will not work for you. Because you can't have any confidence to take the next step. You don't have that assurance that underneath your decisions are the everlasting arms of God. And whether you make the best choice or whether you make a wrong choice, it's not going to result in an infinite failure, because you've got God with you, supporting you, leading you, guiding you, and even if you fall, catching you. And so I hope that all of us can say, oh, I'm ready to jump in on that. And that's where we want to launch this morning. Indecision is a prison. And if you've ever been caught in a period of life, a season of life where you're stuck between, as they say, woe and go. You don't know what to do. It's usually because you lack confidence to make a decision because you can't see where the paths that are the options before you end up. You can't see all the way to the destination that you're trying to get to, or there's so much fog between where you are and where you want to be at the end of the road that you're just uncertain, and therefore you're afraid to take that next step. And my prayer is that this message will provide for you an example of how to have confidence even when you lack clarity. To have confidence even when you lack clarity. We often say, if I just had clarity, I'd have confidence. But you really don't need confidence when you have clarity. You need confidence when you don't have clarity. And that's what I believe we're going to be able to discover today. These are some principles that I have found useful in my life as a leader in the church, in the family, in whatever spheres I've tried to lead in, and I think that you can find them helpful to you as well. And I just want to jump straight in this morning to 1 Samuel chapter 14, verse 1, to the hero of our story. And that's a young man by the name of Jonathan, or not that terribly young at this point, but a man by the name of Jonathan, who's the son of King Saul over Israel. And we're told that one day, because things happen one day, don't they? You have to make a decision in time. And it's like the psalmist says, Lord, teach us to number our days so that we may gain a heart of wisdom. We need to live as if our days are numbered so that we can make the best decisions that we can, and we can recognize that I can't waste my life in indecision. I can't waste my life doing nothing. Sooner or later, the day comes when I've got to move. I've got to stand up and I've got to do something. And that's the day that came for Jonathan as we launch into this study. One day, Jonathan, son of Saul, said to his young armor bearer, "Come, let's go. Let's go over to the Philistine outpost on the other side." But he did not tell his father. Now, the situation was this. The Philistines had invaded the land of Israel, and King Saul had been given a mandate at his anointing that his job was to drive out the Philistines, to deliver the people of God, Israel, from the hand of the Philistines. And the Philistines had not only not been driven out, but they were coming closer and closer and occupying the territory that Saul had been anointed to defend. And nothing is happening. We'll get to more of that in just a moment. But Jonathan is sitting there, and one day he just says, that's enough. This is not how it's supposed to be. I know from what God told my father, I know from what God told Moses in the giving of the law, that the situation that we're living in right now, under the oppression and burden of the Philistines, this is not the way things are supposed to be. And so one day, Jonathan turned to the one person apparently he felt like he could trust and said, come on, let's go do something about this. And it says that he did not tell his father, Saul. When you begin to feel a burden that you think God is placing on your heart because you're seeing in the world something that's out of whack with what He says it should be in His Word, you've got to be careful about who you share your plan with, because there are certain people that you can tell the right plan to the wrong person to, and they will quash the plan before it ever has a chance to get started. And Jonathan recognizes that, so he doesn't tell anyone but his armor bearer. He doesn't tell his father Saul, because Saul has lost his way and Jonathan knows it. In fact, one of the remarkable things about the life of Jonathan is how consistently he lived within the will of God, even though he grew up in a household where his father was living outside of the will of God. But because Saul, the anointed of God, had lost his way, it's not surprising that both he and his men, his army, were at a quandary as to what to do next. They couldn't find the right, they couldn't make a decision. They couldn't make their way forward. They couldn't take the next step. And so it says in the next verse that Saul was staying on the outskirts of Gibeah under a pomegranate tree in Migron. I guess I'd like to hang out under a pomegranate tree. Given all the options that I could spend my life doing, that's one that perhaps would be pleasant, but it's not in consistency with God's purpose for Saul. He's hanging out under the pomegranate tree when God's given him a mandate to drive out the Philistines, and yet there he is, and with him about 600 men, among whom were Ahijah, who was wearing an ephod. Now, that's something that as you're reading through this, you could just sort of easily read past. But the ephod was part of the priestly garments, and Ahijah is a priest. And the ephod is euphemistically used to describe the entire upper portion of what the priest would wear, including a breastplate. And that was used to help them in those days to make decisions about what they should do, to make judgments about what was the right choice to make. And so that's why the priest is there with Saul with this particular article of clothing that, again, it's not just an article of clothing, but it is a device that they had in order to discern God's will. And that goes all the way back to what we read about in Exodus chapter 28, when it began with Aaron, and we're told that he was to wear this when he entered the holy place, bearing the names of the sons of Israel over his heart, because it had the 12 stones symbolizing the 12 tribes, on a breastpiece of decision, it says. Some will say judgment, but the idea of judgment there is the ability to discern, to make judgment. So it's the breastpiece of decision, as the NIV puts it, as a continuing memorial before the Lord. And then it says in the next verse that he also is to put within that, behind the breastpiece, next to the ephod, the Urim and the Thummim, which we talked about briefly in the first lesson. Some sort of a device that they would use that would give them sort of yes or no answers to questions that they might ask of God. So the priest would go before the Lord with the breastpiece and the ephod with the Urim and the Thummim in order to be able to inquire of the Lord what the right choice to make was. And they were to be over Aaron's heart whenever he entered the presence of the Lord. Thus Aaron will always bear the means of making decisions for the Israelites over his heart before the Lord. So I've sidetracked to bring that information in so that we could get the picture as clearly as we can. Saul, anointed by Samuel with the divine mandate to drive out the Philistines, has a Philistine army right in front of him across a valley. And he has a priest who has the ephod with him containing the Urim and the Thummim to help them inquire of the Lord to get answers. And yet, with all of the means necessary in order to take decisive action, Saul is just hanging out under the pomegranate tree, wasting time. And now you get a better picture as to why Jonathan didn't tell his father what God had put into his heart, and instead began to move in a direction that would help him see his pathway forward. Now, I don't think when Jonathan said to his armor bearer, let's go over and confront these Philistines, that he had it all worked out. He didn't see exactly how sneaking away from where everybody else was hanging out under the pomegranate tree was going to eventually result in a victorious battle against the Philistines, but he knew as long as I'm staying right here, we're getting nowhere. Nothing's going to happen. And so he took a step. And isn't it something when you just begin to take a step toward what you have some sense of being the decision you need to make, something that you need to do, that as you take one step, the next step begins to become more obvious. So often what we want from God is we want Him to give us a plan that starts with A, and then B, and C, and D, E, all the way to Z, and we want to be able to see every step of the journey, all the way from where I am to where I ultimately want to end up. And God doesn't work that way. He gives us enough light to get from A to B. You know Z's where you want to be, but you've got a whole alphabet to get there, and you have no idea what all that means. But you can see enough to take the next step. Psalm 119 says, "Thy word is a lamp to my feet." Do you get that image? He doesn't say it's a 50 billion lumen kilowatt, whatever it is, beam that shows you everything from now till the end of your life. It's a lamp to my feet. It gives me the light that I need to take the next step. It doesn't show me everything all the way, but that's what walking by faith means. It means trusting in the Lord, seeing what He's put right in front of me, and taking the next step in faith and confidence that when I get there, He'll show me what's next. That's the kind of faith I want. I don't want to be a Saul stuck under a tree because I can't see the way all the way to the final victory. I want to be a Jonathan who gets up and says, I've got to move. I've got to do something. And so I think we learn a very important principle here from Saul's inaction. And that is disobedience to God's revealed will deafens us to His personal will for our life. Let that sink in. Disobedience to God's revealed will in our life deafens us from being able to hear whatever His personal will for me might be. And you will live in a lack of confidence and in a fog of confusion as long as you're ignorant of God's great plans and as long as you're disobedient to God's specific commands, His moral will for your life. You will never be able to confidently have clarity that you need to take the next step. And that's where Saul was. In fact, the situation that was beginning to unroll right here in this episode comes to its sad end toward the end of the book of 1 Samuel, where we're told in chapter 28 that Saul, when he saw the Philistine army, now this was a later battle, but the same scenario. When Saul saw the Philistine army, he was afraid. And terror filled his heart. And so he inquired of the Lord, but the Lord did not answer him. Not by dreams, not by the Urim, and not by the prophets. He kept trying to find clarity. He kept seeking an answer, but because he had turned himself away from the will of God, he could not hear the will of God. And everything was darkness before him, which ultimately led him to do what? And let me put it this way. I want us to be very careful about this idea that God's a genie that we can manipulate to get to become our personal fortune teller that can show us the future. That's not biblical religion. In fact, if you begin to think of God that way as someone that you can manipulate to give you insight about the future so that you won't have to walk by faith, but you can walk by sight because you see it all the way, you're going to end up where Saul ends up here, unable to see anything at all. And those of you who know the story know what he did next. He went and found the witch of Endor to conjure up for him Samuel from the dead in order to try to get some insight about what the future held. And so that's not biblical religion. And in contrast to all of that, we find Jonathan's confidence growing in the midst of uncertainty as he trusted in the Lord. It says in verse 4 back in 1 Samuel chapter 14, that on each side of the pass, now Jonathan and his armor bearer have gotten up and they've gone over and they've come to the pass. By the way, that's always the place where the enemy sets up against you, is in a passage between where you are and the next place you've got to go. In the valley of decision, that's where you're going to be confronted with options, and the enemy is going to be set up against you. And on this situation, Jonathan looked at it, and on that pass that he intended to cross to reach the Philistine outpost, you know what he saw? A cliff. A cliff to his north and a cliff to his south. One was called Bozez and the other Sinai. And Bozez means thorny and Sinai means slippery. Everywhere Jonathan looked, he saw obstacles. Everywhere Jonathan looked, he saw a reason to turn back. And so if you think that living in the will of God means that the way before you is always going to be smooth, it's always going to be easy, it's always going to be comfortable, then you're missing the point. The place that God may be calling you to go personally as you live your life consistently with His purposes and plans may lead you through some very treacherous territories, some painful places, some difficult obstacles to overcome. But Jonathan is undeterred, and look what he says in verse 6. He says to his young armor bearer, "Come on. Let's go. Come on, let's go over to the outpost of those uncircumcised men." Now he's calling them names. He's getting worked up. He's not letting the difficulty of the journey get in his way. He sees the enemy that is occupying his territory, and he says, "Come on, let's go over to them." And then he says something that's just amazing. Perhaps the Lord will act on our behalf. Wow. You mean you don't know, Jonathan, how this is going to I don't know how this is going to turn out. It's just like Scott read to us or quoted to us from the book of Daniel with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. We think and we know that our God can deliver us from the hand of Nebuchadnezzar, but even if He doesn't, we're not changing our confession or what we believe or the one that we believe in just to satisfy you. And so Jonathan's not turning back. Perhaps the Lord will do this. I don't know. Maybe. Maybe the Lord will act in our behalf. But I know this, nothing can hinder the Lord from saving, whether by many or by few. God doesn't need the 600 men under the pomegranate tree in order to do the job. He can accomplish it through me and you, me and my armor bearer. So come on, let's go on over. And so he moves on, and his young armor bearer looks at him and he says, "Jonathan, do it." Do all that you have in mind, his armor bearer said. Go ahead. I'm with you, heart and soul. Man, that's what you need when you're facing a difficult decision. You need to be walking with the wise and the courageous and those who are willing to back you up and say, hey, if God's put this on you and you're all in and you're committed to making it happen, I want you to understand I am with you to the bitter end. I am with you heart and soul. No matter how difficult it gets, I'm going to be there all the way. And so his armor bearer confirms what Jonathan is aspiring to accomplish. And so Jonathan replies to him. He says, well, come on then. I love that. Look back at this. I love this stuff. Jonathan says in verse 6, come on, let's go over. And the armor bearer says, go ahead, I'm with you. And so the next verse, Jonathan says, well, come on then. I see these two warriors. And they're like chest bumping each other. When I'm saying, come on, the other one's going, do it, go ahead. And he's like, come on. And he's like, yeah, do it. And so finally, they have pumped each other up and they are ready to go. And so they cross over. But when they get to across to the place at the bottom of the hill where the Philistines are encamped, Jonathan says, here's the plan. It's just come to me. We'll wait here until we're going to show. I'm sorry, I got ahead of myself. Jonathan says, let's cross over to them and let them see us. Yeah. Now, I'm going to have a lot to say about this in a moment. This is not the most brilliant military strategy I've ever heard of. You're not going to find this in Sun Tzu's The Art of War or in the soldier's, field manual for success on the battlefield. I thought if you were going to attack somebody, you wanted to sneak up on them. But he says, let's just come on over here. We'll cross over and we'll make sure that they see us over here. And then he says, if they say, wait there until we come to you, we will stay where we are and not go up to them. But if they say, come up to us, then we will climb up, because that will be our sign that the Lord has given them into our hands. So we're just going to keep taking the next step, and we will give the Lord an opportunity to weigh in on this through some sort of a sign. And if that happens this way, then we're going to take that as His will, and we're going to go for it without looking back. And so they began their effort. Both of them showed themselves to the Philistine outpost, and look, said the Philistines, the Hebrews are crawling out of the holes they were hiding in. And the men of the outpost shouted to Jonathan and his armor bearer, come up to us, and we'll teach you a lesson. Something up here we want to show you. Why don't you come up and visit us? So Jonathan says to his armor bearer, climb up after me then. The Lord has given them into the hand of Israel. And so they begin their march up the steep hillside, one part slippery, the other part thorny, and using his hands and feet. Do you get an idea of how steep this is? Do you have any idea of how vulnerable they are in this situation? Here's a little free bonus thrown in. If you want to get into God's purpose for your life, if you want to grow and develop, then there is no victory without vulnerability. There is no victory without vulnerability. There is no growth without risk. And so they put themselves in this situation, and up they go, and the armor bearer right behind him. Then the Philistines fell before Jonathan and his armor bearer, and who followed after him, and they killed behind him. So he had his back. And in that first attack, Jonathan and his armor bearer killed some 20 men in about an area of about half an acre. So that's our biblical story for this morning. And Jonathan is just one of my favorite characters in all the Bible. He's not a major Bible character, but everywhere we look, he is awesome. And so much of it, I think, is simply because of how surrendered he was to the will of God. So much so that when he discovered that David was going to be the next king instead of him, the crown prince, unlike Saul, who could not accept that and would not let it go, Jonathan freely accepted it, embraced it, and said, I'll be your right-hand man. I'll be your armor bearer, David. And that's the kind of person I want to be. A man who has the courage in this story to simply step out in faith, looking at the way things are in contrast to the way they should be, looking at what God's plan for Israel and for the monarchy was, and knowing that what his father was doing, hanging out under the pomegranate tree, was not right. And though he couldn't see a way forward, began to take the steps necessary to get himself into a position where he could see what was next, and following it one step at a time, ultimately achieve the victory that God had in mind. What a powerful story. And he did so without a perfect plan. I think, to me, that's one of the things that really unburdens me as I think about this story. Because that prison of indecision that I get stuck in is usually because I feel like I have to have the perfect plan before I can act. And I think that puts me in a much more Saul-like frame of mind than a Jonathan-like frame of mind. I think the entire future of my enterprise, and maybe the whole world, rests upon Lawrence's ability to make the perfect decision. And Jonathan, in his faith, is showing us something different. With a very poor battle plan, one could say, he accomplished a great victory. About 15 years ago, a very wise man, some of you will know, by the name of Paul Cook, came into my office and he dropped this wisdom bomb on me. He said, Lawrence, most leaders put too much effort into crafting the perfect plan and too little on follow through. Now, Paul thinks I've never listened to him, but I actually did. It's just stuck in my mind ever since. I need to apply it more than I do, but I remember it. And I think that is absolutely the truth. Saul is stuck waiting to hear God's perfect step-by-step plan from A to Z, and Jonathan simply is taking the next step on an imperfect plan and yet won the battle. I get a kick out of people who talk about things like, somebody started up a business and it's a raging success, and somebody's like, I could have thought of that. And they think that it's the thought that counts. They think that because I can think of an idea that I could have done what somebody else did. But there's a lot of ideas out there, and most people can come up with some pretty good ideas, decent ideas, good enough ideas. Good enough ideas are a dime a dozen. What it takes to succeed is not a good idea so much as it is courage and action and commitment and the ability to build a team of loyal members around you so much that they say, go ahead, come on, go ahead, come on, go ahead. I'm with you, heart and soul. And when you have all of that together, then you can make a halfway decent idea turn into a raging success. And that's why the diligent often look much smarter than they actually are. Take Janice, for instance. She's not nearly as smart as many of you think she is. I hear it all the time. She's so smart. And I'm like, she's not that smart. She is not as smart as you think she is. I can prove it too. 34 years ago, she decided, she made a decision to marry someone. Not the best choice. I'm not just kidding. If you had seen me then, if you had seen me then, you would have seriously questioned her intelligence. But what she lacked in discernment, she made up for in commitment. She made up for in character. She made up for in follow-through. At 18 years old, she hadn't gotten too good at crafting great plans, but she'd already developed the commitment, the courage, the character, the resolve, the wherewithal to make a pretty mediocre decision turn out to be something pretty good. And that's why things like abandoning an effort, giving up too soon is rarely a good idea. Divorce is almost always a bad idea because we think, I just made a bad decision and I can fix that by making another questionable decision, and then the next time I'll make a wiser decision. When in reality, what we need to do is apply the principles that God lays down for us in Scripture, which tell us to love, forgive, to keep trying to move forward. This is God's will for us. And so you don't always have to make the best choices. You just need to have the character to make the best of your choices. Isn't that freeing? Isn't that liberating? For those of you who are facing difficult decisions, to let yourself off the hook of thinking it has to be the perfect choice, the optimal decision, or it's not going to succeed. No. Develop the character by walking with the Lord, knowing His plan, trusting His plan, obeying His moral commands for your life, developing in that way the character that you need to make whatever decisions you reach, so long as they're within the context of God's overarching will, to make them work, to make them succeed. That's what we need to focus on. The follow through, not the perfect plan. And so you get that character by trusting, obeying, walking with the wise, and then just taking the next step and seeing what God will do with what you give Him. A quote that I used in the first lesson, only part of, I want to give the entirety of as we wrap this up. Thomas Merton said, we receive enlightenment. I think he's talking about discerning God's plan, will for us moving forward. We receive enlightenment only in proportion as we give ourselves more and more completely to God by humble submission and love. We do not first see and then act. That's what Saul wanted. We act like Jonathan and then we see. And that is why the man who waits to see clearly before he will believe never starts the journey. From one perspective, we might even say that Jesus didn't always make the best choices. Now, before you run me out, hear me out. I mean, from one perspective, when you look at the men that He chose to be His 12 representatives, I think I'm on safe ground here because I heard Paul Earnhardt years ago preach a sermon on the mistakes that Jesus made, and he talked about this. So I think we're good. When you look at the 12 men that Jesus picked to be His apostles, there's a perspective on that would say, most of these guys are illiterate. They're uneducated. Peter's a hothead, impulsive. And though he means well, will most often prove to betray you at the time that you need him the most. Simon the Zealot is plotting the overthrow of the government, and Matthew has capitulated to the Roman government and is collecting taxes for them. This is never going to work. This is never going to work. This is a bad, bad plan. And so from that perspective, you could look at Jesus' decision and say, that's not a good decision. But what that perspective fails to see is the level of commitment that Jesus had to making the plan work. That blows me away. And it's the same level of commitment that He has to making the plan work for me and for you, to see you in His presence, to see you holy, sanctified, pure, righteous, perfect in His sight. And He has given Himself utterly, totally, and completely, not because we deserved it, because that's who He is. And here we are today, and we're headed in that direction. And that's our ultimate example. And if you would like to begin to follow someone like that, that's the way that you become like He is. To make Jesus your Lord, confess Him as the risen Savior. When somebody beats death, when somebody conquers the grave, they're the boss. When somebody wins over death, they're in charge. That's the rule. You win over death, you're in charge. And so, Jesus, you are in charge, and I'm going to follow you heart and soul. You lead the way, I've got your back. You fight in the front, I'll fight behind. We'll just keep on marching down this pathway together. I don't see how every step's going to work. I don't know how we're going to get through all this. It's going to be hard. There's going to be slippery places. There's going to be thorny places. And there's going to be a lot of vulnerability on the way to getting to the top and achieving the victory. But I'm going to follow you because I trust you. If you'll do that, He'll make you into the kind of person who can confidently take the next step and get to where God wants you to be. And you'll live smack dab in the middle of his good and perfect will for your life. If you need the congregation's prayers, or if you want to begin your journey in Jesus' footsteps by putting him on in baptism, we're ready and eager to help you in that regard while we stand and while we sing.